Daktari, sasa nilikuwa nimeona course ya Professor Waboba alikuwa anatumia, so I don't know nikuweke kwa hiyo course or I create an empty one.
No, you can read everything here on my side.
So nikupe hiyo course uone how it is formatted so that you can adjust and add whatever you want to add.
Exactly.
Sawa. Let me add.
Okay.
Aye.
Good afternoon, class. How are you? And welcome to our class today. I hope you are doing well. May I know if you are here?
Daktari, can you zoom a bit? Zoom in a bit.
Okay.
That's okay now.
Thank you, Magdi. May I know if you are hearing me loud and clear? You can comment on our wall so that we can get started. Please. Today we are doing topic 7 on side and the development of long distance and international trade. So may I know from our WhatsApp wall, class wall, if you can hear me? We want to get started. Just a confirmation from any member on our wall. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, class, second years, can you hear me? Can you confirm on our wall that you can hear me so that we proceed? On the wall. So in our previous lesson, we learned about the Portuguese, the coming of the Portuguese and the final conquest and rule of the Portuguese at the East Coast. We looked at the reasons for the coming of the Portuguese. We were saying by the 1500 or 15th century, the Portuguese had traveled to the East Coast with an intention of going to the Far East. But of course, they had great interest in the long distance or the flourishing Indian Ocean trade. So we also looked at the factors that led to the eventual collapse of the Portuguese. Of course, the impact of their Portuguese rule, and later on we looked at the eventual collapse of the Portuguese rule in the East Coast. And one factor that led to the collapse of the Portuguese rule was, of course, the constant conquest and especially the rise of the Oman Arabs that proved to be stronger away and even in East Africa, and they were able to overpower, and therefore they took control of the East Coast. And that is why we are picking up from there that because they were able to displace the Portuguese, then they took over the East Coast and they were able to run it. It's important to note here that it was up to the end of the 18th century, beginning 19th century, with of course the scramble and partition that later on again the Portuguese, the Europeans and specifically the British were able to overpower and therefore they took over the East Africa and thereby colonizing it. So from the late 18th century, the East African coast underwent significant political and economic transformation under the influence of Oman, So this was, we had a central figure in the process of transformation who was referred to as Said bin Sultan. This one was the Sultan of Oman, who later on relocated his capital from Muscat to Zanzibar in 1840. With his shift or relocation of the capital to Zanzibar in the East Coast, it really marked a turning point in the development of the long distance and international trade in the region, and of course, up to date. So here we are talking about the the activities of the Sultan that affected the long distance. And when we talk about the long distance, we are talking about this trade that existed between the natives, the people of East Africa, and the Oman Arabs at the coast. And of course, you know that we had well-known communities in East Africa that participated in this trade. And the most outstanding, which we also mentioned in our previous lesson, was the Akamba. Of course, we had the Hatumas from Sudan. Yes, they took part in this trade. So his reign, that is Said, his reign strengthened commercial networks connecting East Africa coast to Arabia, of course to India. He was able to trade with these people in Persia, in Europe, and the wider Indian Ocean world. So in Kenya, in coast, for example, such towns like Lamu, Pate, Mombasa, Malindi were able to be connected and they actively took part in this trade. It is important, class, that we have to understand the background of Said's rise as a sultan and his eventual conquer of the Portuguese. And therefore, we are looking at the rise of Said's rise to power. And the first one, we want to look at the Oman and Mazrui contestation. It's important to note that from the late 17th century, Oman had gradually displaced the Portuguese along the East African coast. As we learned in our previous lesson, by 1698, around there, they were able to completely outwit them in the coast. And for this particular reason, he was able to displace them, and therefore he took over. So yes, they were able to, of course, displace, but it's important to note that the control remained contested between, of course, the Oman Arab families, and we had two dynasties, the Busaid dynasty of Oman, from which Said belonged, and the Mazrui family of Mombasa, who operated as semi-autonomous rulers. So the coast was therefore politically unstable before Said consolidated Oman authority, because we had this constant, of course, a fight between the two families on which should take over the Indian Ocean trade. So we are saying it was until Said consolidated his the East Coast under his authority. And therefore, we are looking at Said's consolidation of power. How did he consolidate power in the East Coast? For him to consolidate power, he was able to become the Sultan in 1806. This was after the internal family struggles. And after that, he undertook military campaigns to suppress the Mazrui and incorporate the Kenyan coast under closer Oman supervision. So it was to rise to be a sultan. And when you talk about a sultan, he was an Arab overall leader now. Religious, of course, leader who is highly regarded in Islam, and is the one that is now overall. So after rising to become a sultan, he was able to undertake military campaigns, of course, to subdue the other dynasty of the Mazrui at the coast. So by 1837, Mombasa fell permanently under his authority, and he was able to capture Mombasa. And this means that he was now the overall leader. So this political consolidation created conditions necessary for extensive commercial expansion. Let's look at, therefore, the reason for Said's interest in East Africa. Why did he develop his interest to come and control the East Coast? He was driven by what we call economic motivations. It is important to know that East Africa was able to offer him fertile land suitable for, he was very particular about clove plantations. And of course, the spicy islands like Zanzibar and Pemba had suitable lands for the growth or the growing of cloves. There was also abundant commercial commodities such as ivory. Slaves by then were, it was one of the booming kind of trade commodity. Tortoise shell, leopard skins, and gum copper. So these products had ready markets in India. Remember that he used to export to India, that is the Far East, to Arabia, where he belonged, in Persia, and then also to the Europe continent. So the control of East African ports promised enormous revenue, and therefore this economic reason, in fact, was the major one that made him to, of course, relocate his capital. He was also motivated by what we call strategic considerations, whereby dominance over the Western Indian Ocean secured Oman's influence over maritime trade routes. So he wanted to control the Indian Ocean trade for him to secure the maritime trade to these other continents, to the Arab world, to the Far East, and to Europe. And he could only be able to take control of this by securing the East Coast under his rule. Then establishing Zanzibar as a capital allowed also greater control over merchant communities. For example, of course, the Arab community, the coast, the Swahili, and then the Indians. The proximity to the African mainland made it easier to tap into interior trade networks. Another reason was geopolitical competition. This came up as the rising interest of European powers like Britain, France, and Portugal in the Indian Ocean region which pushed the Sultan to strengthen his presence and assert territorial influence. So that competition, you remember the Portuguese had already been defeated, but Britain and France were also eyeing the East Coast. So to do that, then he was to, of course, take control of the Indian Ocean trade. Let's look at the relocation of the capital to Zanzibar in 1840. So Said's decision to move his capital from Muscat to Zanzibar was very, very transformative, and he was motivated by the following: that Zanzibar's climate favored clove cultivation, which became highly profitable. It's also sheltered harbors and strategic position, which made it an ideal commercial and administrative center. The island's existing multicultural merchant population, like the Swahili, the Arab, and the Indian, offered an established commercial infrastructure. Let's look at now his effects on the Kenyan coast. That the Kenyan coast towns became dependencies of Zanzibar because it was his headquarters or his capital, and this therefore meant that they used to pay tributes and therefore participated in trade networks regulated from the island. So as his capital, he was able to manage the Indian Ocean trade from, of course, Zanzibar. So this centralization stimulated economic activity in towns like, for example, Mombasa, Lamu, and Malindi. Let's look at organization of the long distance and international trade. How was it done? Under Said, trade became more systemized and, of course, commercialized and outward looking. The main trading routes included the following: that is the coastal region and the hinterland routes. This connected interior regions with the coastal ports, and this was through the caravan routes, which were led by the Swahili and Arab traders, and the key hinterland regions. We had the Taita Taveta, the Ukambani, which was used by the Kamba traders, the Mount Kenya region, which was used by the Meru and the Embu. Central Tanzania was used by Nyamwezi caravans under the Mirambo and earlier, of course, leaders. Number two was the Indian Ocean maritime routes, which linked the coast to Bombay and Gujarat in India. It also linked East Coast with the Arabian Peninsula. It linked the Indian Ocean or the East Coast with Persia and the wider Middle East. So occasional trade with the European merchants, especially the British and French, used to take place. So what were the commodities that were exchanged during this trade? Those ones that were exported, that is, they came from, they were from Kenya, being exported to other parts of the world, included ivory, slaves, cloves, and gum copper. Those that were now brought from other parts of the world included cotton cloth, beads, guns and gun powder, ironware and utensils, dates, spices and luxury goods. It's important for us that to note that this kind of trade, the Indian Ocean trade, was able to flourish because of the main actors, or what we call the major actors that took part in this trade. So let's look at the role of different actors in the trade. And when we are talking about the trade, we are talking about the long distance trade from the interior of East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Sudan. And then when we talk about the international trade, we are talking about the East Coast and the other parts of the world, like the Arab world, the Far East, and Europe. So the following were some of the major actors in the two types of trade that I've just mentioned: the long distance trade and the international trade. So the first ones, we are looking at the Arab merchants. So the Arab merchants played a leading role in caravan trade, of course, by organizing large expeditions inland. They also established numerous trade settlements and plantations along the coast. Then, of course, these Arabs now got in touch with the Swahili middlemen, and the Swahili middlemen linked Arab traders with African communities. We have just talked of the Akamba, the Ameru, the Khatumas, among the Yao, among others. African communities also took part. They provided, for example, goods, especially ivory, and acted as porters or guides. So they used to carry the goods from the interior to the east coast. They were also used as guides. That is, for example, when the Arabs wanted to go into the interior but could not trace their way. So the African communities were or got involved actively by guiding these strangers. And of course, we have mentioned such important communities like the Akamba, the Wadawida or the Taita, and the Nyamwezi, that is in Tanganyika of Tanzania. Then we had another one known as the Indian Banyan or merchants. These ones were invited by Said to settle in Zanzibar, and they dominated in the area of finance. Remember, these were very key again when it came to the construction of the railway later on in the 19th century by the British. So these people, because of the earlier knowledge in terms of finance, they were able to be in charge of finance, credit, and commercial accounting, which even made the trade more structured. They also became key partners in international trade. Let's move on and look at the slave trade and Said whether he was able to promote slavery. So although the slave trade, of course, predated Said, it expanded during his reign, reaching its peak by the 19th century. So it did not start with the side. Slave trade was there. You learn about it in third year and even fourth year. Third year when you'll be looking at the themes in African history. We had such formation of the chattel slave trade that existed before their coming. But we are emphasizing here that this slave trade took another trajectory and shift on an upward trend when it came to his leadership. So slaves were used for what? Because they were now being enslaved. Remember that one of the key reasons that attracted Said was the plantations, the cloves plantations, which was coupled with the good climate and the soils. So he grew cloves plantations, and therefore he wanted such laborers to work on the farms. The slaves were also required for purposes of domestic service, especially those ones that were taken to the Arab world. Export to Arabian, Persia, and occasionally to the French islands. So partly those Africans that were enslaved, they were used to provide labor, and also that is on the plantations, and then provide domestic service in back in their country, that is in the Arab world. But we are saying that these slaves, again, to some extent, yes, were exported, especially the surplus ones. Those without end task were again transported to other parts of the world. So because of this kind of trade, later on we had what we call the Anti-Slavery Treaties, which signed several treaties with Britain. We have what we call the 1822 Moresby Treaty, then 1845 Hamilton Treaty. And therefore, this did not completely abolish the slave, sorry for that. Let's proceed. And so therefore we are saying that although Said was able to sign the agreements with the British for purposes of stopping slave trade, he did not completely stop enslaving Africans. But later on, we are saying It was done on small scale with a focus being shifted to other commodities like ivory and cloves. So having looked at how it was organized, remember, these commodities were taken from the interior of East Africa, from Sudan, from Sudan, from Uganda, from Kenya, from Tanzania. They were now taken, of course, carried to the East Coast by the porters or the caravans. And once they reached the East Coast, of course, they were now being transported to the other parts of the world, to Asia, to Europe, and the Arab world. So what was the impact of Said's commercial policies on Kenya? Let's look at the economic impact. It increased commercial activity in coastal towns. Remember, after subduing the Portuguese, who had, of course, interfered with the flourishing trade, they were able to, Said was able to bring it back to life, and therefore the trade later on flourished during his reign. There was also growth of caravan trade from interior to Kenya, whereby more interior routes were opened for purposes of transporting commodities from the interior to the East Coast. There was also promotion of specialization in various economic sectors. For example, the Akamba specialized as long-distance traders, while the Taita specialized as porters and middlemen, and the Swahili were able to specialize as maritime merchants. So his activities led to the growth of coastal urban centers, for example, Mombasa, Lamu, Malindi, and Pangani. These towns were able to grow to bigger cities because of the increased trade flows. Remember, we had the international community. We are talking about the international trade. Traders came from all over the world, in Europe, in Arabia, in India, and most of the countries in the Far East, to come and trade. And this led to the growth of these towns. The integration into the world economy, whereby Kenya became linked to the Indian Ocean Trade Network. When we talk about the network, we are talking about the network between Kenya and Arabia, Kenya to Far Eastern India, Kenya to Europe. And while they opened up Kenya for international trade, the global demand now for ivory fuel for deeper penetration into the interior, because now it opened up the eyes of many, even the European nations, to discover that, oh, so ivory exists in the interior. So there was that rush for the ivory products. We also had what we call the social and cultural impact. whereby there was a spread of Islam. Remember that Said became the Sultan, the leader of the Muslim religion, and therefore he ensured that there was widespread of Islam and Arab culture along the caravan routes. There was also increased Swahili cultural influence in the hinterland. Remember that the Swahilis also took part in this trade as maritime traders. There was also interactions between the communities intensified, whereby, for example, the Taita and the Akamba and the Aembu and the Gikuyu. And as such, when we have communities rushing to acquire the resources that were needed at the coast, it caused what we call conflicts between these communities over, for example, the elephant hunting zones and the caravan routes. Remember, when any community controlled a caravan route, they used to get tribute from the porters. It also brought about political changes, for example, strengthening of coastal rulers allied to Zanzibar, and for those ones, for example, we said we had those like the Mazrui, they were subdued and ruled by Said Said. And because he established his authority and his even court system based on the Sharia, it led to the decline of autonomous local chiefs in coastal areas because they had to completely now pay homage to him as the Sultan. It also increased interest of European powers, especially in Britain, which later led to, of course, when Said engaged so much in the slave trade. You know, this one later on, of course, it impacted negatively on the British because they had interest in the East Coast. They wanted to get markets for their finished products. By this time, 1820, 1850, Britain had industrialized, and therefore they did not want to take part in the slave trade. And that is why they rushed to sign the anti-slavery laws that we've just talked about in order to stop this act, which, according to the British, was inhuman. It also led to what we call diplomatic presence between the European nations, again, like the British and the Oman Arabs. It is this that later on led to what we call eventual colonization with the declaration of Kenya as a British protectorate in the year 1895. It is also important, therefore, class to look at the decline after Said, because he did not rule forever. He died in the year 1856, and because of this, his empire was divided between his sons, that is Zanzibar under Majid, and then Oman under Thuwain. So this, of course, this division therefore weakened the centralized control and opened opportunities. You see now, he was able to control the East and even the Oman Arab world. But with his sons taking over Majid and Thuwain, there was that kind of division. And the Europeans, therefore, took advantage of that to send their explorers and the missionaries to counter the spread of Islam. And also the explorers' work was to explore Africa, the coastline and the interior, and inform the mother country for purposes of eventual colonization. And these reports from the explorers and missionaries is what later on led to the European colonization of Africa, or what we refer to as the European imperial intervention. People like Dr. David Livingstone, when he crisscrossed the Central Africa and he was able to witness the kind of slave trade that happened, he wrote to his mother country immediately and asked for their intervention to stop the slave trade. So what have we learned today, class? We have learned about Said and his rule in the East Coast after he was able to defeat and conquer and defeat the Portuguese, and thereby displacing them. And his shift from Muscat to Zanzibar, where he relocated his capital. And then, of course, we have looked at the factors that led to his interest at the coast, among others. So I have just given the highlights. I know you will get the notes, go through them. We have a lot of resources, learning resources in our library. Please read more on Said from, of course, as an Oman leader or ruler, later shifting to the East Coast and taking over the coastal towns and thereby ruling them. And of course, his impact and the eventual death that brought about the family wrangles between his sons. So thank you. Allow me to take you through the next topic quickly. We intend not to take much time. I just want us to go through it in the next 30 minutes or so. We shall be done because it is a topic that you have interacted with. So in the previous topic, of course, these topics are just connecting to each other. You remember the previous one, we were able to look at the Portuguese rule at the coast. Yes. First of all, we looked at the early visitors, how they came about. Then later on, we now looked at the Portuguese. The Portuguese, with the defeat of the Portuguese, the Oman Arabs took over. That is why we've looked at Said. With his death, of course, we have just reiterated here that his death opened a doorway for, remember that he was a threat to most European countries. And therefore, when he took over the East Coast, he was able to scare the Europeans. But with, of course, his death and the sons taking over and the divisions among his sons made the Europeans to come in and therefore take over. Now, this is now brings us with With the death of Said, it brings us to topic 8, the coming of European traders, explorers, and Christian missionaries in Kenya. We are looking at pre-1894. Okay, so the activities that took place with when the Europeans got interested with that is specifically in Kenya, and we shall be looking at the British, and of course the desire to send the traders, the explorers, missionaries. We are just connecting. Remember, we talked of the missionaries and the explorers who crisscrossed Africa, and therefore writing back to the European countries, mother countries, informing them that resources are lying unexploited in Africa and in Kenya particularly. Yes, that there was rampant slave trade, and therefore there was need for European intervention. So we are looking up to pre-1894, because remember, when you step to 1895 is when the British now had declared, of course, Kenya as their protectorate. So we are saying that from early 19th century, European involvement in East Africa gradually shifted from casual coastal trading to deliberate exploration, missionary work, of course, to counter the spread of Islam, and eventually imperial conquest. So in Kenya, the arrival of the European traders, explorers, and missionaries played a significant role, of course, in transforming socio-economic, political, and religious landscape, thereby ultimately paving the way for British colonization. This topic shall examine, of course, when you talk about the Europeans, who are they? What were their motives of coming? The roots and activities in Kenya, their interaction with African societies, their contribution, limitation, long-term impacts, and how their presence laid foundations for colonization, that is British protectorate in 1895. So the coming of European traders happened, that is before 19th century. Europeans had limited direct involvement with mainland Kenya, and this means that they are used to trade, of course, with the Oman Arabs at the coast, and they did not have direct link from the interior. They had to rely on the Oman Arabs and, of course, the long distance communities like the Akamba, the Yao, the Hatumas, the Nyamwezi for the commodities. So, but by 1800, global economic changes, especially the Industrial Revolution, created a demand for the raw materials and new markets. Remember, by 1820, Britain had attained their technological takeoff in terms of industrialization. So what were the key drivers for European trade in East Africa? What made them to come? Industrial Revolution, of course, which laid the basis for eventual colonization of Africa. Remember, they had industries, and the industries needed to be fed with the raw materials. So they required raw materials such as cloves, ivory, gum, copper, rhinoceros horns, and the spices. with the acquisition of these materials, these raw materials were to be processed and then, of course, shared. Once they processed them, they were supposed to export them for sale, and therefore the need for ready markets of the finished products. The British also signed a slave trade charter or treaty to abolish completely slave trade in 1807, 1870s. Remember, this is the time when the British had industrialized and therefore they did not need human capital. So I don't know if the abolition was genuine or not, because they needed these Africans to remain in Africa for them to buy the finished products. So the issue of now claiming that slave trade was inhuman was not justifiable. And therefore, you see, they call this slave trade as illegitimate. And therefore, there was need to introduce what we call legitimate trade. There was also competition among European powers, for example, and that is why we talk of the rise of nationalism in Europe. Initially, there was only Britain, which was industrialized and, of course, powerful. Later on, by 1850, France had taken lead also and was industrialized. In 1870, Germany had also taken lead in industrialization. And remember the Franco-Prussian War, the war between France and Germany, which later on Germany, of course, emerged as a winner, suppressing the French. And after that war, there was the urge of colonization to show superiority complex. So they wanted to compete, and a nation's power was measured on how many colonies do you have overseas. So because of that, the European countries decided to colonize more and more overseas countries. Let's look at some of the major European traders in Kenya. They include the following, and you see, when you shall be looking at these traders, you'll discover that some of them were, again, missionaries. So they played the role of missionaries together as trading or traders. So we have, for example, Ludwig Kraft and Johannes Rebmann. They were both missionaries and traders. Johann Ludwig Hadid also was a trader. William Stanley. And then we had also the chartered companies. So remember the Imperial British East African Company, which was led by William Macnon. So what did the Europeans trade in? Of course, they took from Africa ivory, which was most valuable, cloves and gum, copper, animal skins, grain, and rubber. So they were able to interact with African communities, and they depended mostly on the Swahili caravan organizers known as Wangwana. The African chiefs also played a very key role. We talk of Nabongo Mumia of the Wanga, who was a king by then. These Africans, especially those ones who collaborated, were able to allow the Europeans or the British to come and trade in their territory. They also relied on potters from Nyamwezi, Taita, Kamba, and Pokomo. So what was the impact of European trading activities in Kenya? Positively, they introduced new goods for exchange of ivory and others. So they brought cloths, beads, and guns. There was also stimulation of caravan trade routes into the interior. More routes were opened up for trade. Then there was development of commercial centers such as Mombasa and Taveta. Negative impacts include intensification of slave raids due to demand for potters. So as much as they were saying they wanted to stop slave trade, they still needed these potters to carry their goods to the East Coast. So there was also increased warfare as with the introduction of guns, disruption of local industries. For example, we learned about the local industries like iron smelting, cloth weaving. They just brought now the ready-made clothes which replaced the clothes that were as a result of the weaving industry. Let's look at the coming of the European explorers. Let's look at the motivation of European explorers. So European explorers came to East Africa for purposes of scientific curiosity, for purposes to map the geography and ethnography of Africa. They wanted to draw the map of Africa. Search for the source of the River Nile. People like John Speak. You see, the British were in control of, you remember the Egyptian question? They had displaced the French and therefore took over Egypt. But you see, in history, we say Egypt is the Nile and the Nile is Egypt. Why? Egypt is a desert country which relies entirely on the waters of the Nile, River Nile. And therefore, you could not control Egypt without controlling the source of River Nile. And where is the source of the source of River Nile? Is Lake Victoria in Uganda. And that is why the colonization, the British colonization of Kenya was strategic. Because how do you now enter Uganda without going through Kenya? Kenya offered a shortcut from the East Coast to Uganda. And that is how now later on, you see Sudan was also colonized because the Nile passes through Sudan. So that is how the search of the River Nile is what brought about the colonization of Kenya and therefore controlled Uganda, which was the source of River Nile, Lake Victoria, that is. And then, of course, Sudan, because the river passes through Sudan to Egypt. Then the Christian humanitarian motives also, the anti-slavery movement to stop slave trade, strategic and political motives, which was the preparation of the ground for colonization, and economic motives for purpose of identifying trade routes and resources. Let's look at examples of the explorers. Johann Ludwig. This one was a German missionary and explorer who was sent by the CMC, that is Church Missionary Society, arrived in Mombasa 1844 and established the first mission station at Rabai near Mombasa. First European to travel to Kambana and the Taita region, He was able to document numerous Kenyan languages, translating the Bible into local languages. Johannes Rebmann, 1846, the champion of craft, first European to report seeing Mount Kilimanjaro covered with snow. His reports were initially ridiculed in Europe, and they were wondering how can a mountain in just around the equator, where the sun is always overhead, could have the snow. That is why his reports were ridiculed. But of course, it made the Europeans to come and prove that indeed, because of its height, the higher you go, the cooler it becomes. The top of Mount Kilimanjaro indeed was and still covered with snow. David Livingstone, who visited the East Africa but not in the interior of Kenya, he was a missionary and explorer concerned with the ending slave trade. It is his writings that inspired increased European interest in East Africa. Joseph Thomson is another one. This one was a Scottish geologist and explorer for the Imperial British East African Company. So he explored Maasai land using non-violence, and he used to say, "He who goes gentle goes safely." So he mapped routes from the coast to Lake Victoria via Taveta and Maasai territory and demonstrated that a railway could be built to the interior. It is his report that informed the construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Count Samuel Telek and Ludwig von, these were Australian explorers who reached Lake Turkana. Of course, when they reached there, Turkana was named as Teleki initially, but later on renamed it as Lake Rudolph. He also explored northern Kenya. Henry Morton Stanley, this one was famous for his exploration in Congo and Lake Victoria region. His writings increased European interest in East Africa. Having looked at explorers and some missionaries, let's look at explorers. Let's look at the contribution of the explorers. Of course, geographical knowledge, whereby they mapped routes, rivers, like the sources of River Nile to be Lake Victoria, lakes, and of course, mountains. They provided data used to build the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Ethnographic documentation, whereby they documented cultures, languages, and political systems. So you will find that much of these documents were biased. That is why we shall be learning another course known as the Issues in African Historiography, whereby we shall be looking at the Eurocentric writings that were done by the explorers and how biased they were. And later on now look at the Afrocentric writings. Are they also politically influenced because they recommended European intervention to stop slave trade and thereby establishing colonial rule? They also helped European governments to plan colonization. They also paved the way for missionaries and traders. They provided maps, reports, and security information. So the explorers created awareness about East Africa. They promoted anti-slavery campaigns and opened up regions for trade and evangelization. It's important also to note that these reports that they wrote about had a negative effect about Kenya. For example, their reports exaggerated Africa, of course Kenya inclusive, to be backward, and therefore it justified that indeed Kenya, and of course the larger Africa needs to be colonized. Exploration routes became future colonial invasion routes. Remember, when they came to invade, they followed up the routes that the explorers had indicated. They also exposed African societies to new diseases and warfare. Let's look at the coming of Christian missionaries. So what were the motives of their coming? For purposes of evangelization, where they could convert Africans to Christianity. This was just a counter attack of the prior spread of Islam during the Oman rule. There was also need for, according to them, they were motivated for purposes of civilizing mission, that is to introduce Western education, and of course, educate the Africans who are backward, in quotes. The abolition of slave trade, and that is to replace slave trade with the legitimate commerce. So according to them, legitimate is where we use money and also other resources other than human beings. Then strategic alliance, that is to support European imperial expansion. Remember, in history we say the missionaries came in one hand carrying the Bible and in the other hand carrying the flag. What is the implication of that statement? That as much as they came to preach with one hand, the right hand, the gospel about Jesus, the left hand was carrying the flag. The flag was behind them. They were opening ways, yes, for eventual colonization of Africa. So we had major missionary groups, for example, the church missionary societies, which arrived in 1844, of course, led by Ludwig Krapf and Johann Rebmann, among others. They were able to establish centers at Rabai, Taita, and Ukambani. We had also Holy Ghost fathers. These ones were Roman Catholics who arrived in the 1860s and established missions in Zanzibar, in Pangani later on, Tanga, and Mombasa. Scottish Presbyterians focused on central Kenya, where the Kikuyu region. They founded missions at Kikuyu, Tumtum, and Chogoria. The Methodists also, they were very active in Meru, Embu, and Kisii areas. The Mill Hill Fathers, or the Roman Catholics, also established stations in Nairobi and Western Kenya. Let's look at the missionary activities in Kenya. What did they involve themselves into? Evangelization. So preaching Christianity in local languages. Remember, we talked of Krapf as the first person who did the translation into, of course, the Swahili and the Giriama local languages. Another mission apart from evangelization, which was core, was to provide education, and they established schools. For example, the first one at Rabai, where they taught Africans the basics like writing, reading, arithmetics, carpentry, and of course, agriculture. Health services, they also built the first hospitals and dispensaries. You look around almost each part of the country, we have what you call mission hospitals, like we have here around Lugulu is a mission hospital, Mumias, okay? They also promoted what they call, and we have kept on saying legitimate trade because it is not justifiable. So we talk of legitimate trade in quotes, whereby now they used currency and now the trade was entirely involved the trading commodities like cotton, coffee, among others, but not human beings or slaves. There was introduction of new values, which to them they used the European yardstick. Their cultures, according to them, were civilized, but Africans were uncivilized, and therefore they were justifiable to introduce literacy and monogamy, that is the marrying of one wife. So they really condemned Africans for marrying many wives. Western legal systems to replace the traditional ones, and new gender relations. And therefore it's important, you remember, I've just talked about the missionaries in one hand carrying the Bible and in the other hand carrying the flag. Did they, by chance, for example, contribute to the rise of imperialism and eventual colonization? We are saying yes, especially in Kenya by the British. They provided information. Of course, this information supplied colonial governments with maps, intelligence, and advice. They also provided in their reports the moral justification that indeed Africa is a backward country and it needed Western civilization. Reduction of African resistance, for example. They acted as intermediaries, telling Africans not to resist but accept the European rule. They also brokered what we call treaties. And you see, these treaties were signed in English, were written in English. And so Africans just signed, for example, the Maasai, they signed treaties only to discover that when it was translated, they had given up their land to the Europeans without their knowledge. The same happened to the Lozi. So for those communities that collaborated, the missionaries were used to broker or to enter into treaties. So how did Africans react to the missionaries? It's important to note here that the reaction of African was mixed, and it varied by region. For example, we had those ones that were received positive reception from Africans, for example, acceptance of Western education by the Gikuyu, Luo, and coastal Christians. Africans also accepted to use missionary health centers. There was also conversion by freed slaves like Akamba, Kenda, and Taita. But we have those ones, Africans that resisted the coming in of the missionaries. And the reason was that the missionaries threatened to destroy traditional beliefs. Africans also resisted them because of the fear of foreign domination, and therefore they wanted to remain independent. The Africans also were very wise to discover that the work of missionary was closely linked to colonialism. And therefore, you'll find that communities like the Nandi and the Giriama were resistant to welcoming the missionaries. Therefore, what was the impact of traders put together with the explorers and missionaries on Kenya? We had social impact, for example, the spread of Christianity and decline of indigenous beliefs, introduction of Western education and medicine, the writing and reading, the creation of Christian communities and new elites came up. Economic impact included the growth of caravan trade into the interior, expansion of agriculture and new crops, introduction of wage labor, disruption of local industries. I'm just highlighting them because we have already looked at them and therefore we don't have to waste time on them. So what about political impact? Treaties between explorers, missions, and chiefs were signed. Of course, we have just talked about these treaties that they were written in a language, a foreign language, that the Africans could not understand, only to be translated, and they were shocked that indeed they were not signing for the same. So it also led to decline of African political autonomy because, like for example, the Buganda or even the Wanga here, the leaders were reduced into mere persons. Okay. Preparation for British administrative takeover, which of course the missionaries and the explorers did. Therefore, what was the long-term impact of these categories that we